Okay, today's lesson is going over the basics of Zbrush to help you get started if you are interested in experimenting with that program. So this screen right here is about what your screen will look like once you open up Zbrush. This menu right here, where my cursor is the lightbox, which is something I'll kind of describe later. It's basically it's sort of like Adobe Bridge, where you can kind of find existing models that you have on your computer or textures or alphas and kind of load them into your scene. So it kind of works as a library here. So just to close the lightbox, you can press this lightbox button right here. The button is also over to the right here. If you want to kind of move around in the lightbox, you can press this arrow, or you can press right here to close it. So I'll just, either of these two buttons works to close it out. And so here we are in ZBrush. So the first thing I want to show is how to just create a basic primitive sphere and begin sculpting on it. So there are about 3 steps to it, and it won't work unless you do each of the steps here. So to start off, just kind of, I'm going to just quickly go over the basic interface here. Is we have the basic canvas here. We have some of our brush parameters up in this region. We have our choice of brushes and materials and colors kind of on this side. And again, I'm going to go over this in much more detail as we progress here. And then over here, this tool menu is an area where you can create primitive objects or import models that you've exported out of Maya here. So to create a basic primitive sphere, just click right here on this top, whatever is the top left icon in this menu. Right now it's on Simple Brush for me. The Simple Brush tool, if you use it, it kind of looks like this. It's not a useful tool. I don't know anybody who actually uses that. But it's kind of whatever tool is in this top left icon is the active tool. So if you just click on it, like a normal click, this menu should show up. And you'll have these options in this top bracket up here. And what we're going to do just for this demonstration, you can actually use any of these 3 between the Sphere 3D, Cube 3D, or Cylinder 3D. But I'm just going to press Sphere 3D. So you'll see that it changed from the Simple Brush to the Sphere in terms of the active tool. And so in order to draw it onto the canvas here, just hold down, just press down and drag left to right. And then if you hold shift, you'll see that it kind of locks into position there, so it'll stop rotating. So when you're done, just finish dragging. And you'll notice here, if I just try to rotate or sculpt on this thing right now, it'll just keep creating new spheres, which is not what we want. So what you want to do is just draw it out and hold shift to just kind of lock it into place so it doesn't rotate here. Oops, my cursor went a little crazy there. All right, and so once you draw it out onto your canvas, you're just going to want to press this edit button or press T. And so what this button does is it makes the object editable. Because before, when we drew anywhere, we just kind of create new objects. So now we can at least like move it and rotate it if we wanted to. But you'll notice still that when I try to draw on it, this error menu comes up. So there's just one third final step that you have to do, which is press this Make Polymesh 3D button right here under the tool menu. So it's just right above where we created the tool in the first place. If you press this Make Polymesh 3D, it turns the mesh into a fully editable object here. And so now when I draw on the mesh, you'll be able to sculpt. So just to kind of, I'm going to edit, undo, and get out of this real quick. Just to show that again. So that kind of, let's see, to edit and undo, I'm going to do this. I'm going to just show this one more time. So you press the tool button right here, and you can pick your basic primitive object that you want to edit. This time I'll just do the cube 3D just to show that you can do different basic shapes here. I'll draw it out, pressing shift to kind of lock it into position here. Then I'll press this edit button to make it editable. You'll see this white square should kind of show up around it with this rotate box kind of showing up. And then finally, just press this make polymesh 3D button. And now when you sculpt on it, something will happen. So basic navigation in ZBrush, just like Maya, if you press F, you'll zoom in on your object here. If you just do a normal click on the canvas outside of the object, you can rotate it. So you can kind of rotate around just by clicking right here. If you press Option and then you click, you can pan. And then if you press Command, which is right next to the Option button, so both of these buttons are right next to your space bar. So if you press Command and then you do a middle click, or sorry, a right click, you can zoom in and out. So one really important thing here with ZBrush is it's pretty much unusable with a mouse. So it's pretty much a requirement if you want to use this program, or it is a requirement if you want to use this program, just like Mudbox, that you need to use some kind of stylus here. Because when you sculpt with a mouse, it's you'll see that you won't have any control over how strong or soft your brush strokes are, and it'll just make your life really difficult here. So make sure that you're working with a stylus here. And one advantage to ZBrush over Mudbox is a small advantage here, but since pan is Option, the command is right click and zoom in and out, you don't need a stylus that has two buttons on it. You can just use one button here, and you don't need to program your Wacom differently or anything like that. You can fully navigate around your scene by just pressing out here with the normal click, then doing Option click and moving it around, and then a command click, and then right clicking, and you can zoom in and out. And again, F frames up your object just like in Maya. You'll notice here that the perspective of this cube is a little strange looking. It looks a little flat right now. So an important next step here before you start working is to press this perspective button, this right here where my cursor is. The shortcut for it is P. So if you press P there, you'll notice that this object jumped into perspective here. If you try to sculpt on an object here, especially if you're sculpting a face or a character or anything like that, and you just work outside of perspective mode like this, when you import it into Maya or another 3D program, you'll kind of be in for a big surprise in terms of it just being strangely shaped here. So this is a really important button to press before you start working it. So that's the perspective button right there. So that's kind of how to get started sculpting here in ZBrush. So the next thing that I want to show here is when I sculpt, you know, that looks a little low resolution right now. You know, you can just only see a few squares come up. And so if you want to pump up the subdivisions, this is a lot like Mudbox, where you just need to add subdivisions to your geometry here. And so on the right here, once you've kind of created an object, if you scroll down just by clicking where my cursor is and then just dragging, you'll see this geometry tab right here. So if you click on the geometry tab, all you need to do is under the geometry tab, press the divide button, and it'll subdivide the geometry. And you'll see here there's a slider here for the subdivision. So I'm going to divide it twice. And so now we're on the third subdivision level, and I can drag it to bring it back to the first subdivision level, so you can kind of move back and forth as you're working here. So we might need to add one more, but you can see that's starting to kind of fill in a bit. When you're working with a sphere, you won't need to subdivide it this many times. Just working with a cube, it's a little more challenging to, or you know, it just takes a few more subdivisions to kind of get up to a working value here. So now the sculpt tool is working here. So to get started here, I'm going to just start describing some of what you're seeing out here and on the left and then on this top section right here. So your standard brush, so I'm working with a standard brush, which you can see right there. And if you look over here all the way to the right on this top bar, you'll see Z add, Z sub, and then Z intensity here. So that's just the, by default, it'll be an add mode here. So when I sculpt, it adds to the model, right? And then if you go Z sub, it'll subtract into the model. So you can press those two buttons to go back and forth. Z add is the default. If you press Option on your keyboard and you sculpt, that's the shortcut for Z subtract. And I highly, highly recommend just memorizing that shortcut here, because when you're sculpting, you're going to be wanting to work quick, and you don't want to be just kind of going back up here every time you want to switch between adding and subtracting. You know, you just want to be able to, this will add, this will kind of cut your work time almost in half just by kind of memorizing that shortcut. So again, Option is Z subtract right there. And then Z intensity is the intensity of your brush. So if I bring that up to 100, this brush is going to be very strong when I sculpt. And then if I bring it down to a low value here, it's going to be really subtle when I sculpt. You know, you can barely see it right there. Let me just bring it up a little bit so you can see it a little more. You know, so it's a little more subtle. And this brings me up to why you really want to work with a stylus here, is with my stylus, if I just have the Z intensity set to, let's just say 30, if I'm pressing lightly on my stylus here, I can get something kind of subtle when I sculpt. And then if I press hard, I can get it all the way to there. So you can kind of get these nice gradations in your work here. And if I were to sculpt with a mouse, it's just, I'm sculpting with the mouse right now, you can see you're stuck with one level here, and there's just no way to kind of make something even remotely artistic working that way. So that Z intensity slider there is a good example of why you really need a stylus to work in this program. And you don't need a fancy one. It's just anything that where your pen has one button, and you'll be good to go here. So that's all there is to the Z add, Z sub, and Z intensity right there. This section right here is the RGB and all that stuff has to deal with colors, which we'll go over later in the class when we're talking about texture painting using ZBrush. Right here, you know, we have the edit button where we made the object editable, and then we have the draw, and you'll see that these different modes, so draw, move, scale, and rotate are different modes here, and when you're sculpting, 99% of the time you're going to be in draw mode here. And the upcoming lessons, I'm going to show when you'll want to use move, scale, and rotate, but the vast majority of the time you'll want to be in draw right here. So that's kind of a broad overview of this section right here. Looking down to this section, I'm going to go from the bottom to the top here. So right here we have the color of the material. If you change the color here, see I can change the model to black here, but it doesn't, it's just the preview of the model. It's not actually changing the color if you were to export it into Maya. It's just a preview color here. So at least at this stage in the sculpt. So just kind of leave this at white. You'll be glad you did. And then when we get into texture painting, that's when this will kind of start to come up. Next up is the material. And so the material, again, is just kind of a preview material when you're sculpting. And this comes down to personal preference. Again, whatever material you use here, it won't show up in Maya once you export it into Maya. It'll just kind of give you a different viewpoint of what this model looks like while you're sculpting. And this just entirely comes down to personal preference. You know, if I'm sculpting a shiny object, sometimes I might want it to be in this reflect mode here. Most of the time, I kind of like to work in matte cap gray. And the reason I like matte cap gray is when you are sculpting this way, you're not going to get too many surprises when you bring this into ZBrush as an AI standard surface or anything like that. Let's see here. So texture and alpha, these are two things where this can kind of be like projection painting in Mudbox, where you can get some detailed textures kind of projected onto your model. I'll go over this in future lessons, but that's kind of what these two areas are for here. This is the stroke section, and so by default it's on dots, and that's usually what I want most of the time. There's some other options you'll see here, and these can be useful for other applications. For instance, the drag select you can kind of use when you're doing your projection painting in ZBrush, where you can have a texture and just kind of drag it to kind of drag that texture on. But for initial sculpting, dots is what you're going to want most of the time here. So just the defaults are great, especially for your initial sculpting. So next up, we have the brush. So the default brush is kind of what you've seen so far. It's a standard brush, and it's just kind of, it's a little bit rounded. And yeah, it's a nice default brush. It's and if you press on this, you'll see we have a massive selection of brushes here in ZBrush. So that's the nice thing about ZBrush. It can be a little overwhelming. And one thing to keep in mind is it's just good to play around with these and see what you like. But in my experience, you know, you don't need all these. It's just, it's nice to have them around to experiment and try things out. But you can go a long way using, you know, 5 of these and get some really nice results. So amongst these brushes here is we have the standard brush, and then we have the smooth brush in here. The smooth brush smooths out hard edges here, and you don't ever need to select it in here, because the shortcut for the smooth brush, no matter what brush you're using at the moment, is if you hold down shift, keep your eye right here, it'll go to smooth. So I'm just pressing shift right there, and you can smooth out your edges. And so, yeah, shift is another important shortcut to learn here. So shift, no matter which brush you're using here, whether it's any of these, if you hold down shift, you'll go straight to smooth. So I'm going to show some more of these brushes here down the road, but I'd say the most important brushes to know are the standard brush. Can be really useful here. If you press this, you'll see that there are a lot of brushes, but if you look closely, these are in alphabetical order. So if you know the name of the brush you want to use, for instance, I know I want to show you the move brush next. So I press M on my keyboard, it'll narrow it down to the brushes that start with M. And then, so the move tool is right here. So if I press V now, it'll go straight to the move tool. And so for the brushes that you like the most, I highly recommend just kind of memorizing what the combination is there, to just kind of jump to it real quick instead of looking through all of these every time you're trying to find it, right? So the move tool is M and V, and then the standard brush is S and then T. So S and T gets you the standard brush, and then M and V give you the move brush. So you don't have to kind of go in there and kind of find it in that amongst that large library right there. And so the move tool lets you just kind of pull out geometry. It's exactly like the grab tool in Mudbox. And especially in your kind of concepting phase, it works like the soft selection brush in Maya, where you can kind of just broadly move out your geometry here pretty rapidly. So the standard brush and the move brush are really helpful. And then kind of a personal favorite of mine are the clay buildup and clay tubes brushes. So if you press C, and on my computer right now it's kind of not showing them, but fortunately I know the shortcut for them, which is C and T. It's the clay tubes brush. And this brush looks like this initially when you're looking at it, and so it can look a little rough around the edges here, but especially when you're kind of just starting out, kind of sculpting, let's just say like muscle structure or something like this, this can be a really useful brush for just building up a mass here. So let's just say that I'm kind of sculpting a shoulder on a character. You can see here I can kind of quickly build up volume and take it away here. And And then if I press Option, I can kind of cut it out here. And you can kind of quickly build up organic forms this way. And most professional modelers, if they're kind of building a character, they'll kind of start out with this when they're just kind of working rough. You know, they're not worrying about what every little detail looks like in here. They're just trying to kind of build up their basic forms. The clay tubes brush can be really helpful. So kind of going over this section right here and this section right here, the main shortcut, or one of my favorite shortcuts in this program, is if you press spacebar and hold it down, you'll get this menu right here. And you'll see here that I have the, oh, and I forgot to show it before. Over here you have the draw size and the focal shift of your brush. And so the draw size is the size of your brush here. And then the focal shift, if you look inside of the brush, there's a second circle inside of it. And this is easiest shown in the standard brush. So with a large brush size, you know, the larger the brush size, which is down here. Let me close this tab so you can see that a little better. So the draw size, or the brush size right here, is the size of the brush. So you can increase it there. You can also use brackets for this, I believe. If you're used to the Photoshop shortcuts, it's a little slow. But the brackets are another shortcut if you want to change the draw size. So that's the draw size. And then the focal shift is the circle that's right inside of it. And so if the focal shift is small like this, it'll kind of gradually build up the shape. So if I look at it from the side, you'll see how it gradually builds up that curve. And if I take the focal shift and I bring it close to the edges here, it's going to have a much steeper fall off when I sculpt. You see, if I look at it on the side, it's kind of more of a steep plane, you know, when you sculpt here. So that's what the focal shift is. So that's the draw size and the focal shift. Apologies that I forgot to mention that earlier. It kind of went off to the side of my screen there. So that's right next to the Z add, Z subtract, and Z intensity here. But all these shortcuts right here and here, or all these parameters, I'm sorry, right here and here, you can get to just by pressing and holding down your space bar. So, and I use this constantly when I'm working, so you have the draw size right there, you have the focal shift right there, the Z intensity right there, Z add, Z subtract, edit mode. You can choose your brushes right here, your brush stroke right there, and then what kind of material you're using. And so most of what you need when you're sculpting is right here when you're working. So just hold down space bar and you can kind of get to your brush menu real quick, or get to your draw size or your intensity. It's all right there. So that's a lot of the basics here. And remember also with the clay buildup tool, if I hold down shift, I get the smooth option, so you can kind of smooth out your work here. So you can kind of build up your work really quickly there, and then just smooth it out if you really, you know, if the textures bother you or something like that. And so, yeah, the smooth tool really helpful, which is the shift button. And so just kind of continuing to talk about the interface here is we have this section over here. So remember, the perspective button is a really important one, because if it's off, it'll be kind of like an orthographic view where there's no perspective to it, or it's a very little perspective, and it can be really hard to sculpt this way. So just make sure that I have that on when you're working. This button here gives you a floor plane, and this can be useful down the road here in one of the upcoming lessons. I'll show you how to bring in your reference images, just like in the orthographic view in Maya. So if you want to trace your drawings when you're sculpting, we can actually project onto the planes here. And the way you get the different planes right here is, so we have the floor plane right now, but it's hard to see, but we have an X plane right there, and you just turn it on by pressing the little grayed out little tiny X within the button. And then we'll also have a Z, and you can kind of turn them off and on however you want. And so you'll be able to kind of project your drawings onto these planes and kind of use them as a traceable reference here. And so, yes, and you can just turn that off whenever you kind of want to turn off your reference drawing. So that can be a kind of nice way to work here. So that's that button right there. I'm going to go over this button later here. So this button, if we're kind of moving down a little bit, we have the frame button, switches. Let's just say your model's off here and you're having trouble finding it. If you press this, it'll frame it up, which again is the shortcut F. Here is the move tool, which is again the shortcut option on your keyboard. Does the exact same thing. So if you hold on option, that'll do this button. Zoom 3D. If you press down command and you press either right click or the button on your stylus, on the side of your stylus, if you're using a Wacom or anything like that, it'll zoom in and out. And so that's most of these areas right here. Just to continue moving, we have these sections right here which zoom in and out of the canvas or move the canvas in and out. So if I do the zoom in and out, you see the whole canvas that we're working off of moves in and out. So if it's like this or something and you want to see the whole thing, you can just press this and then just drag your cursor vertically to scale it down. You can press this button to scale it vertical. So that's like in Photoshop, or sorry, After Effects. When you press the actual size, it can kind of just punch the canvas into full frame there by pressing actual. Then actual half is, half size right there. And let's see here. So talking about the canvas a little bit further, we have all these menus up here which I haven't approached or brought up yet. And so I'll go over a few of the important ones right now. So right now we have document. And so what document means, you would think logically the document means this is where you save your project and stuff like that, or at least for me, that's what I thought when I first opened ZBrush. But what the document refers to is actually just this canvas, this working space that you're doing here. So I don't really mess with this very much. Typically, if I don't like my model and I want to start over on the model, there's a few things I can do to start over, but something I do a lot of times is I'll just go to document and then go to new document right here, and it'll give me a new canvas to work off of. And keep your eye to the right over here. When I do a new document, you'll see that this tool, this kind of, they call it a tool in ZBrush, that's kind of their lingo for it, but the object that I've kind of started doesn't get totally deleted. It's still stored in temporary memory at least when I create a new document, but at least the canvas will be cleared here. So I'll go to document and then new document. And you can see here with a new document, you can change the width and the height of the preview if you want something higher resolution or something like that. Those options are right here. So I'll just press new document though. And I'm going to say I don't want to save the changes. And so now I just have a new canvas to work off of here. So I can press the actual button or zoom in and out just to kind of bring it to full frame. And you'll see here the tool I was working on before is still saved in temporary memory. So if I press that right now, it would come back on the screen. But instead what I want to do is I want to just create a new polysphere, or sorry, sphere 3D to kind of show a few more things here for you to get started. So if I press this, I want to create a new sphere, so I'm going to press sphere 3D right here. So again, I just press the tool that's in the top left up here. That's the active tool. So I'll press this and then press sphere 3D, and nothing will show up. That's okay. I'll hold down shift, or I'll drag and then I'll hold down shift to lock it in so it comes out flat. Then I'll press edit and then go over here to make polymesh 3D. And once I press Make Polymesh 3D, you'll be able to sculpt on it. But unless you do the edit and then the Make Polymesh 3D, you won't be able to work on the object here. And so the reason I made a new object here is there's just a couple more things I wanted to show, and it would be best to just start with a new sculpt in order to show you that. So I showed you the Documents tab up here. The next tab I want to show you is the Transform tab right here. And so if you press transform, you have all these options right here, and there's some really useful ones. For instance, there's this line polyfill, which the shortcut is Shift F, and if you press that, it'll give you a wireframe view of your object. So if you need a wireframe, you just go to transform and then poly F our line fill. And again, the shortcut for that is Shift F for anyone. So if you press Shift F, it'll kind of turn off and on. But again, you can find it right here. But more importantly, if you kind of look down here, you have Activate Symmetry. So let's just imagine that you have a character that you want to work on. If you activate Symmetry right here, and Symmetry is set to be along the X-axis right now, it makes it so that when I sculpt, we got a symmetrical model here on both sides. So right now it's set to X, and you can turn it off and on by the shortcut is X on your keyboard. So if you don't want to go to that menu, if you press X, it'll turn off, and then X, it'll turn back on again. You can also change your symmetry to be along the Y or the Z axis, or you can turn them all on at the same time, and you can have this kind of radial symmetry start to happen in your sculpt. You see it went from the top to the bottom there, so it's a pretty wild kind of thing you can do there. So you can kind of get symmetry and along 3 different axes there. So I'm going to turn those off. And remember too that this looks a little aliased and low resolution right now. So the way to add resolution to that is again just kind of dragging down here under the tool tab to the right, and then finding geometry. And then under geometry, you should have this divide button right here. So if you just press divide, you'll see here, and I'll press it to get 4 divisions just for this. You can see that as you subdivide it, the resolution will kind of come together here. And so now when I sculpt, we can kind of get some more detail here. And so the last thing I want to show here is within this kind of basic overview of how to use the ZBrush interface here is if you want to start a new tool, based off of a primitive object and start entirely in ZBrush, we do what we've done before here, where we press this top left icon under the tool menu and then find which one of these primitive objects you want to start with. If you've made an object in Maya, like a base mesh in Maya that you want to import in ZBrush for detailing, in Maya you'll want to go to File, Export, and export it as an OBJ. So an OBJ is what you'll want to export it as in Maya. And again, that's if you just go to the top left under File and then go to Export and then save it as an OBJ. You can import in here by pressing Import right there. My computer's going a little slow here. And then okay, I don't have any OBJs there, but you can import it just by going there and then locating the file. You can save your project in this menu right here as a ZTL. But what I typically recommend doing is, and I kind of do that sometimes, and it's just a bad habit because it's the way that I did things for a long time moving forward, and ZTLs are fine. So you can save your project here, but what I've kind of learned in recent years is typically a more comprehensive way to save your progress here is if you just go to File, and then, so at the top here, File, Save As, and save your project. You can save it as a ZPR, and a ZPR is just a more comprehensive save, and that'll become more apparent as you kind of get more into detailing and texturing and stuff like that. So the best way to kind of work in ZBrush, I think, is in terms of managing your projects, is to just go to File and then Save As right here. And then when you open up ZBrush again, you just at the beginning of your project and you want to pick up a project that you had already started, just go to File and then Open to open up an existing project. So if I go to File, Open, and just choose an object here, you can see you can open up a project that you already started here. This model right now is in Z-spheres, which is the next technique I'm going to show in the upcoming video. And it's a way to kind of, instead of starting a model with just a primitive sphere or cube in ZBrush, you can use Z-spheres to build out a model, you know, like a nice little base mesh to kind of get you started here. And so it's a technique that I really like to use in ZBrush to kind of build out my characters. So that's something that's coming up. And so one nice thing about ZBrush before we leave here is that you can, unlike Maya, you don't really need project folders for ZBrush. I think it's nice as a good habit to kind of continue to work within your Maya project folder and kind of keep everything in the same folder structure. So typically when I'm working in ZBrush and I'm not just doing demos and I'm working on a long-term project, I'll file, save as, and then find my project folder like this, and then under scenes I'll make a ZBrush folder here, and then save my ZPR files into here. And so that way whenever I'm saving my overall 3D project, you know, my 3D project at large here, I can just save this whole project folder and have everything just in one place and not be looking around in different areas of my computer while I work. So in ZBrush, you don't need the project folder like you do in Maya, but it is nice to kind of, especially if you already have a project folder open in Maya, I like to kind of still work within it there. So that's just a recommendation there. And so that's kind of a broad overview of how to get started in ZBrush. It can be a little bit funky at first, but those are kind of the main steps and the main shortcuts that you need to just kind of get started there. So if you're having any trouble with that, I'm going to try to time code this video and just kind of look through and maybe see where things are, you know, if they're going wrong, where they're going wrong for you there. My experience with ZBrush here is to kind of do a lot of sculpting here. You don't need to get too crazy complicated with it. If you just know the steps that I showed in this one video lesson here, you can get pretty far in ZBrush. So, and it's just a matter of practice here, because a lot of times, let's just say you're starting with a basic primitive object and you can't sculpt on it. You know, if you missed any of those steps between the edit and the make polymesh 3D, it won't work, and so it can get frustrating for some people. But just kind of refer back to this video if anything like that is kind of frustrating you, like a failure to launch on any kind of one thing. And once you get used to it and you practice it, this program can be pretty intuitive to navigate here. And then one last thing before we go is save a lot. This program crashes a good amount, and so just always be saving. Just file, save as, and keep your work saved, because especially if you have Google Chrome open or any other programs, it will it depends on your computer, but this program's known to crash a lot, and there's no auto saving within the program, so a lot of the time you'll kind of lose your work. So just make a habit of saving while you work here. All right, until next time.